I never imagined I would walk into a boardroom filled with men who had spent the last year trying to erase me, only to watch their faces collapse when the state registrar confirmed my name as controlling owner. The silence was heavy enough to feel physical. Andrew, my cousin, froze with his pen mid-air. His brother, Martin, looked like he'd swallowed something sharp. And the chairman they had courted so aggressively suddenly leaned back as though he were witnessing a coup he hadn't been warned about. But the real moment, the one seared into my memory, was the expression on Andrew's face when he realized the document I had filed 3 days earlier wasn't forged, wasn't contestable, and wasn't something he could bully his way out of. It was Grandpa's signature. Legally witnessed. Time-stamped. Ironclad. And it transferred ownership of the entire company to me. He whispered, "You didn't." I said nothing. The registrar spoke for me. Mrs. Hale is the majority shareholder. Effective immediately. Their fight for power, their secret meetings, their ugly scramble for the CEO seat, it all became meaningless in an instant. They had been so busy trying to tear each other apart that they never saw me walking quietly through the side door of their battlefield. But don't misunderstand me. I didn't come here seeking revenge for petty slights. What pushed me to do this was deeper. Older. A betrayal that settled in my bones and stayed there until I could no longer ignore it. They had stolen from me long before they tried to steal from each other. And their downfall began the day I finally opened the old wooden envelope Grandpa left me. An envelope I had avoided for years because it still smelled like his pipe tobacco. I didn't know then that it contained my freedom. Or that it would bring them to their knees. But before I tell you how I learned the truth, and how calmly I pulled the ground from beneath them, I need to tell you who I am, and why none of this unfolded the way they expected. What I did was not an act of rage. It was an act of restoration. One that had been waiting patiently for decades. And when the moment came, I stepped into it without trembling. Because they had already done the worst. And they never imagined I would fight back. The irony is that I never wanted the company. But they made sure I had no choice. And by the time they realized it, the papers were already filed. The stamp was already dry. And their empire, the one they believed would always belong to them, was no longer theirs. Not by blood. Not by right. And certainly not by law. But the story of how I got there, that begins much earlier, long before the boardroom fell silent. And it begins with my name. My name is Eleanor Hale. And I am not the woman my cousins thought I was. Why did Grandpa leave her the company? And why did she wait so long to use the papers? My name is Eleanor Hale, and I am 62 years old. I've lived most of my life quietly, intentionally, and far from the kind of corporate drama my cousins wrap themselves in like a second skin. I run a small pottery studio in the northern part of the state, where the light falls warm and clean through tall windows every morning. Clay grounds me. It slows the world down, forces breath and patience and presence. I used to believe that a life built around gentleness was enough. That I didn't need the noise of the Hale family empire to validate my place within the bloodline. But age has a strange way of sharpening clarity. Loss sharpens it even further. And betrayal. Betrayal turns clarity into something crystalline and sharp enough to cut through decades of silence. When Grandpa died, I was 53. He was the last anchor in a family that had learned to mistake ambition for identity. My cousins were already circling the company back then, drawn to the promise of control like moths to a flame. I wasn't even in the building. I was at my studio, glazing a set of bowls, when the lawyer called. I remember wiping my hands on my apron before answering, not knowing that everything in my life was about to tilt. But when he handed me the sealed wooden envelope at the reading of the will, I felt a weight I couldn't yet explain. I didn't open it. Not then. Not for years. The timing didn't feel right. Or maybe I wasn't ready for whatever truth it held. I suppose you want to know what kind of woman waits 9 years to open an envelope from the man who raised her more tenderly than anyone else in the family. The truth is simple. I trusted him. Implicitly. And I believed that whatever he wanted me to know would reveal itself when the world around me made space for it. It's strange how often instinct whispers what logic can't articulate. I spent those 9 years trying to stay out of my cousins' reach. They never liked the fact that Grandpa favored me. They never forgave that I was the one he taught to read financial statements before I learned algebra. They thought he wasted his time on me because I had no interest in using those lessons to climb the corporate ladder. But Grandpa never taught me things for their utility. He taught me because he believed knowledge softened fear. He was right. And his death left a quiet echo in my life. A silence that didn't fill until the day my cousins decided they no longer needed to pretend I was part of the family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before they betrayed me, before they stole what wasn't theirs, before they weaponized my trust against me, I was simply Eleanor. A woman who wanted a peaceful life, a soft routine, and the dignity of choosing her own path. I didn't know then that I would be forced onto a battlefield. And I certainly didn't know I was already holding the one document that would end the war before it even began. What exactly did her cousins do to push her into the fight? My relationship with Andrew and Martin was complicated long before lawyers, documents, or boardrooms came into play. We grew up together, but the word together does a lot of heavy lifting. They were brothers. Loud, competitive, and constantly measuring themselves against one another. I was the quiet one, the girl who spent summers reading in the garden rather than racing bicycles down the gravel driveway. They tolerated me as an accessory to the family, useful when they wanted praise for including the odd one, and invisible otherwise. Grandpa tried to bridge the gap. He insisted we spend holidays under the same roof, even when tensions simmered just beneath the surface. He used to say, family is not chosen, but how we treat each other is. Andrew always rolled his eyes at that. Martin pretended not to hear it. Both boys were raised to believe the company was their destiny, and because of that belief, they grew into men who saw people only as stepping stones or obstacles. As we entered adulthood, the divide widened. I built a quiet life teaching art classes and repairing old kills. They built reputations for aggression, Andrew with his charismatic ruthlessness, Martin with his cold, strategic detachment. They didn't just want the company. They needed it. It was the mirror they looked into to see proof of their worth. Grandpa's affection for me irritated them. But when he began involving me in business discussions, asking my opinion, trusting me with documents, their irritation curdled into resentment. They told themselves I was manipulating him. They told others I was too soft for the corporate world, that Grandpa was losing clarity in his old age. They constructed a narrative in which they were heroes, and I was an inconvenience. But when Grandpa passed and the company transferred to a temporary trust, the cousins' rivalry intensified. They each began campaigning for the future CEO role long before the board even announced a timeline. Whisper campaigns. Backroom deals. Empty promises. Watching them was like watching two men wrestle over a crown that wasn't even on the table. For a while, I stayed distant from it. Their world was not mine. But everything changed the day they decided to clean up the family structure. Which is to say, they cut me off. They called it a reorganization of non-essential stakeholders. They told me it was for my own financial protection. They convinced the accountant, who owed them far too many favors, to freeze my dividends while they conducted a review. They thought I would panic. They thought I would beg. Instead, I walked back to my studio, closed the door, and sat with the first real tremor of anger I had felt in years. Not because of the money. Because of the audacity. Because they believed my silence meant insignificance. Because they forgot who taught me to read contracts. Because they forgot who raised me. And because, without knowing it, they had just lit the fuse that would bring everything crashing down. What was the betrayal that finally broke her silence? The moment that broke whatever fragile thread remained between us arrived in the form of a thin white envelope with my name typed incorrectly. Inside was a notice informing me that my grandfather's lakeside cabin, my sanctuary, my inheritance, the place where he taught me everything that shaped the woman I became, had been transferred out of the family trust and into a corporate asset liquidation schedule. In simpler terms, they sold it. Without my consent. Without notifying me. Without blinking, I drove up to the lake the same afternoon the letter arrived. The path that once smelled of pine and damp earth was cluttered with the noise of construction equipment. Strangers were measuring windows, assessing foundation strength, preparing to turn my grandfather's cabin into a short-term rental property. A man in a reflective vest glanced at me and casually said, "You here to pick up the last personal items?" The owners said family might come by before demolition. Demolition. The word hollowed me out. I walked around the cabin slowly, touching the porch railing Grandpa carved with his own hands. I pressed my fingers against the doorframe marked with years of notches, the growth chart he kept for me when I was small. Memories rose like soft waves, the smell of stew simmering on the stove, the crackle of the fireplace, his gentle voice explaining balance sheets and kindness in the same breath. And now, gone. Signed away by two men who had never once appreciated the history beneath its wooden beams. That night, I sat in my car overlooking the lake and opened the wooden envelope Grandpa had left me 9 years earlier. I don't know what made me choose that moment. Maybe grief. Maybe instinct. Maybe the quiet whisper of his presence urging me forward. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a letter. The second was a will addendum. The third was the ownership transfer they never knew existed. I read Grandpa's handwriting by the light of the moon. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means the boys have forgotten what legacy means. I am giving you control not to punish, but to protect. You will know when it is time." My breath froze. The addendum clarified that I, alone, held controlling shares of Hale Industries upon his death. Not the trust. Not the board. Me. A single signature from me, filed with the state, would activate ownership retroactively. My cousins had built their entire lives on a foundation that wasn't theirs. And they had just demolished the one place in the world that held my childhood and Grandpa's memory. If there was ever a moment to honor his faith in me, it was now. I closed the envelope with steady hands. The fuse they lit reached the powder. And the explosion had begun. How does she begin gathering evidence to strike back legally and ethically? I spent the next morning in my studio, not touching clay, not even turning on the lights. The wooden envelope lay open on my work table like a quiet declaration of war. I knew instinctively that filing the ownership document without preparation would be reckless. Andrew and Martin were ruthless, but they were not stupid. They had lawyers. They had connections. They had spent years maneuvering themselves into positions of influence. If I intended to step into the arena, I needed to do so with precision. So I began the way Grandpa taught me, with documentation. I drove to the county clerk's office and requested copies of every land transfer linked to the trust. Then I pulled bank statements, board minutes, and internal memos, most of which were public filings if you knew where to look. What I found was worse than I expected. The cabin wasn't just sold. It was leveraged as collateral in a personal loan Andrew secured without board approval. They had misrepresented its value, siphoned funds through a consulting shell company, and buried the paper trail under layers of misleading category codes. I photographed everything. Next, I scheduled a meeting with an attorney Grandpa had worked with, a quiet, meticulous woman named Clara Dawes, who had retired but still advised selectively. When she saw the documents I carried, she tapped the table once, a gesture Grandpa used to make when preparing for a difficult truth. "Eleanor," she said softly, "your grandfather predicted this." Her calmness steadied me as she reviewed the addendum and ownership transfer. When she finished, she leaned back and studied my face with a mixture of respect and concern. "You have absolute legal authority," she said. "But you must file strategically. If you submit the ownership transfer before establishing evidence of mismanagement, your cousins will claim you're staging a hostile takeover. If you wait too long, they could destroy more assets." I asked her what she recommended. "Document everything," she said. "Every misuse of funds. Every breach of fiduciary duty. If you're going to do this, you need a record so clear the board has no choice but to accept you." So I did. For 3 weeks, I moved through my life with the quiet precision of someone rearranging fault lines beneath a city. During the day, I taught my pottery students. In the evenings, I became an investigator. I collected emails. I collected signatures. I collected inconsistencies in audit trails and discrepancies in corporate expenditures. Every piece of evidence was a stitch in a tapestry revealing not just incompetence, but intentional misconduct. But the final confirmation came from a whistleblower, someone inside accounting who had grown tired of being bullied by my cousins. She handed me a flash drive, trembling slightly, whispering, "They think you're irrelevant. That's their weakness." The drive contained everything I needed: internal memos confirming their intent to freeze my dividends permanently, and a plan to liquidate more family properties. They weren't just cutting me out. They were erasing me. That night, I called Clara. "It's time," I told her. She didn't ask for details. "Meet me at the registrar's office Monday morning." And with that, the quiet phase of my investigation ended. The moment to act had arrived. How does she finally decide to fight openly? And what pushes her over the edge? Sunday evening arrived with a weight I could feel in my chest. I sat at my kitchen table with the wooden envelope open before me and reread Grandpa's letter for the 100th time. His handwriting, always steady, seemed to reach across time to steady me as well. "You will know when it is time." I knew. The demolition for the cabin was scheduled for Wednesday. They hadn't even allowed me a final walkthrough. The thought of that house, Grandpa's chair, the faded quilt, the photographs still nailed to the walls, being bulldozed without a moment's pause was the final push I needed. But the real turning point came when Andrew called. He never called me. His voice was polished, almost pleasant. "Eleanor," he said, "we're finalizing the restructuring this week. We need you to sign an agreement waiving any claim to board input. It's a formality. A formality. A voluntary erasure." My heart didn't race. My voice didn't shake. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a stillness so complete that I knew my path had crystallized. "Email it to me," I said. He sounded satisfied. Smug. He had no idea that I had already assembled enough documented violations to collapse his position entirely. When the email arrived, I printed it, placed it on the table, and stared at the blank signature line. This was the moment of choice. Compliance or confrontation. Silence or legacy. Fear or truth. I picked up a pen and signed my name at the bottom. Not on the line. Across the page. From corner to corner. A single stroke of refusal. Then I folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope, and mailed it back. On Monday morning, I met Clara at the registrar's office. She wore a navy coat and carried a folder thicker than mine. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for 9 years," I said. We submitted the ownership transfer with a timestamp, a digital record, and certified copies. It was done in under 15 minutes. A quiet action with irreversible consequences. When we stepped outside, the air felt different. Lighter, sharper, almost electric. "What happens next?" I asked. Clara adjusted her glasses. "They will find out. And they will panic. But panic is not your concern. Tell the truth. Let the documents speak." I nodded, feeling Grandpa's presence in the steadiness of my breath. That afternoon, I sent every piece of evidence to the board. The misappropriations, the unauthorized loans, the liquidation plans, and the whistleblower memo. Then I sat at my pottery wheel and centered a lump of clay, letting the rhythm anchor me as the first aftershocks hit. My cousins called. They texted. They sent emails. I ignored every one of them. By evening, a board meeting was scheduled. By morning, the registrar's confirmation was delivered. By noon, the entire company knew. And for the first time in their lives, Andrew and Martin realized the battlefield they had been fighting on did not belong to them. It belonged to me. What happens when the board confronts the cousins and the downfall begins? The boardroom was already buzzing when I walked in. Some directors murmured greetings, others watched me with guarded curiosity. But the moment Andrew and Martin entered, the atmosphere shifted into something brittle. Andrew's confidence faltered when he saw the registrar present at the head of the table. Martin's jaw tightened when he noticed Clara seated beside me, reviewing her notes with quiet authority. The chairman cleared his throat. "We're here to confirm recent filings and address allegations submitted to the board." Andrew launched into a performance immediately. "This is absurd. Eleanor is confused. She has no standing." The registrar interrupted him with a calm finality. "Mrs. Hale is the majority shareholder. The state has verified the transfer. Her standing is indisputable." Silence fell like a hammer. Andrew's composure cracked. "This can't be right. The trust. The addendum supersedes the trust," the registrar replied. Martin tried a different angle. "This must be fraudulent. We demand verification of the signature." Clara slid a folder across the table. "Here are the notarized witness statements, dated and archived. Your grandfather ensured this transfer was airtight." Their desperation became visible, a slow unraveling that neither charm nor intimidation could mask. When the chairman opened the folder containing the evidence of their financial misconduct, the room shifted again. Line by line, their actions were read aloud: unauthorized collateralization of family property, concealed consulting payments, dividend manipulation, and fraudulent asset liquidation. Andrew paled. Martin looked sick. The board began whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads, others glaring at the cousins with the coolness of people betrayed by men they once supported. The chairman asked, "Do either of you deny these actions?" Neither spoke. They couldn't. Clara leaned slightly toward me. "This is the moment," she whispered. I rose slowly. "I did not come here seeking retribution. I came because my grandfather trusted me to protect the company when those entrusted with it lost their way. I am not here to humiliate anyone. I simply want the truth restored." The board absorbed my words. Something softened in the room. Not sympathy for my cousins, but respect for the restraint they themselves lacked during their own power struggle. The chairman finally delivered the verdict. Effective immediately, Andrew Hale and Martin Hale are suspended pending formal investigation. Control of the company transfers fully to Mrs. Hale. Andrew stood abruptly, fury trembling in his hands. "You won't get away with this." I met his anger with stillness. "I already have. Legally. Quietly. Without lying. Something neither of you managed." He stormed out. Martin followed, but not before looking at me with an expression that flickered between disbelief and reluctant acknowledgement. Their downfall wasn't explosive. It was quiet, measured, legal. Exactly the way Grandpa intended. And when the door closed behind them, I felt a peace settle over me. Not triumph, not vengeance, but alignment. A return to the truth. The truth they tried so hard to bury. How does she rebuild her life? And what happens to the cousins afterward? The days that followed were strangely calm. The board transitioned smoothly, perhaps relieved to pivot away from the chaos Andrew and Martin had created. Clara guided me through decisions I never expected to make: interim leadership appointments, a forensic audit, a restoration of the trust's proper structure. I didn't step into the CEO role. I had no desire to. Instead, I reinstated a seasoned operations director Grandpa had admired. The company didn't need another ego at the wheel. It needed stability. As news spread internally, employees reached out quietly. Some offered cautious gratitude, others relief. More than one person confided that the cousins had ruled through intimidation, unpredictability, and blame. Hearing those stories didn't bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. Their downfall wasn't something I inflicted. It was something they built with their own hands. The cabin demolition order was cancelled. I visited the lake the next week, walking through the quiet rooms, inhaling the familiar scent of cedar and dust. The construction equipment was gone. The property now sat under my name again, safe from liquidation or repurposing. I ran my fingers over the notched growth chart on the doorframe and allowed myself to feel what I hadn't in months. Grief, yes, but also gratitude. Grandpa's legacy endured, not through the company, but through the wisdom he planted in me. As for Andrew and Martin, the investigation moved swiftly. They attempted to rally support, but few allies remained. Their arrogance had eroded goodwill long before I entered the boardroom. Eventually, they resigned under pressure. Not fired. Not destroyed. Simply removed from the pedestal they were never meant to stand on. They sent no apologies. I expected none. Life has taught me that some people mistake remorse for weakness and honesty for surrender. My cousins were among them. They never understood that accountability is not a punishment. It is a path. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my studio. Clay felt different beneath my hands, as though reflecting the steadiness I had reclaimed. Students noticed it too. One said, "You seem lighter." Another said, "You look like someone who just set down something heavy." They were right. But the most profound shift came one evening when I sat alone on my porch, watching the sunset wash the sky in soft amber. For the first time in a long while, I felt Grandpa beside me, not as a memory, but as a quiet affirmation. I had done what he trusted me to do. Not out of vengeance. Out of preservation. Out of love. Out of truth. I didn't destroy my cousins. I simply stopped carrying the burden of their actions. The consequences were theirs to bear. Finally, rightfully. And I, at 62, felt a new chapter unfolding before me. One built not on survival, but on intention. One where I no longer stood in the shadows of other people's ambitions. One where I reclaimed not only what was mine, but who I had always been. What final lesson does she leave the audience with? If you've stayed with me this long, you may wonder whether taking control of the company changed me. Whether the act of filing those papers awakened some hunger for power I never knew I had. The truth is simpler than that. I didn't want the company then, and I don't want it now. What I wanted, what I fought for, was dignity. And dignity, I've learned, is something you defend not with rage, but with clarity. My cousins taught me a harsh lesson. Silence is not always graceful. Sometimes silence becomes an invitation for others to rewrite your place in your own story. I believed stepping away from the family empire meant choosing peace. But true peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries. Grandpa understood that. He anticipated the storm long before I saw the clouds forming. His trust in me wasn't rooted in ambition. It was rooted in character. He knew that if the company ever fell into the wrong hands, I would not use his gift to punish, but to restore balance. And that is the moral I carry with me now. Revenge built on anger collapses. Revenge built on truth endures. Not because it harms others, but because it protects what should never have been threatened. We don't choose the families we're born into, but we do choose the lineage we create through our actions, the integrity we uphold when no one is watching, the courage we show when everyone is. If you ever find yourself facing people who underestimate you, who diminish you, who believe your quietness makes you weak, remember this. Quiet does not mean powerless. Stillness does not mean surrender. And patience is not passivity. Sometimes it is preparation. I didn't win because I was ruthless. I won because I was honest. Because I had evidence when others had excuses. Because I trusted the long arc of truth. And because, when the moment finally arrived, I stepped into it without fear. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Stand up for yourself not when others give you permission, but when your spirit tells you it is time. Fight back not with cruelty, but with documentation. Seek justice, not destruction. And never, ever underestimate the power of a quiet woman holding the right papers. My name is Eleanor Hale. I am 62 years old. And I reclaimed my legacy not by shouting, but by signing.